Sometimes I think because we're a couple 100 years removed from him, we assume that Joseph Smith received revelation in a vacuum, meaning that Joseph would just get a revelation on a subject without ever having any thought on the subject beforehand. Now, certainly, I'm not saying that these types of revelations never happened, but I think history shows that many more times than not, revelation came as Joseph would ponder upon a subject, ask the Lord, and then would receive revelation. Today I have Cheryl Bruno on the podcast as we discuss Joseph Smith and Masonry. Now, many of us in Mormonism get a little bit beat up over Joseph being a Mason by our evangelical brothers and sisters. Well, today Cheryl puts some of this to rest as we discuss what Masonry's role was in 19th century America, what Joseph's interactions were with Masonry, and what it is he saw in Masonry, and what it means for us today as Mormons. Now, as unsettling as this subject seems to be on the surface, I'm sure that by the end you'll come out of the other side of this episode more convinced of ever of Joseph Smith's prophetic calling. That and more on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So a few weeks back, I told you about a new online merch store I was putting together and that I would let you know as soon as that was up and running. Well, after a few weeks of working on designs and testing it out personally, we're ready to launch. So if you go to MormonRenegade.com and click on the Renegade Supply button in the top right of the landing page, or click the link in this episode's show notes, you'll see that we have 16 items right now that you can choose from. We have shirts, hats, bags, cups, and water bottles, all with the Mormon Renegade logo, as well as a couple other designs that I think you'll find really funny. And maybe even one where I take a slight shot at BYU, but you should definitely go check that out. Now, this is just the beginning. In the coming weeks, more designs and styles will be available for purchase. Now, all the proceeds I get from this are going to go right back into the podcast. So head on over to MormonRenegade.com and press the Renegade Supply button, or click the link in this episode's show notes and get yours today. Cheryl, thanks for being on.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So I got to tell you, I have enjoyed following your work for a number of years. I felt like you were one of the voices that added to the tapestry out there, especially when it comes to understanding Joseph Smith and maybe showing how maybe some of that revelatory experience that he had came forward. And I can't tell you how much I've appreciated reading your work over the years.
Thanks. I'm so glad that people are reading it. I had so much fun working with this subject. So I'm really glad that people are finding it useful.
Right. Now, were you raised in the church?
No, I wasn't raised in the church. I'm a convert, and I joined the church when I was 19, and I went on a mission when I was 21. And so now that I'm 64, I feel like I've been in the church forever. So when people ask me that question, I kind of want to say, yeah, but no, the first 19 years of my life, my dad was a Protestant minister. So I was raised kind of in the evangelical tradition, although my dad was very liberal as well. So I don't know, I have kind of a different background.
No, I'm a convert as well. Now, we didn't have, certainly my mom had she was Catholic, but not like the kind of go to church every Sunday Catholic. I remember going with my dad, and I remember going to mass on the holy days, right? And being like, what do I do? And he'd be like, just pay attention to the old lady up front. When she stands, we stand. But no. So I can definitely identify there with what you're saying. How did you get into Mormons and Masonry? I mean, that's a deep hole to go down, right? I mean, was this something you were always interested in? Did you discover it later? I mean, what happened there?
Yes, I've always been interested in the early church and Joseph Smith's Mormonism, which I feel is a little different than the Mormonism we have today. And so I've always just tried to pick at it and learn as much as I can about what Joseph Smith was doing and what Nauvoo was all about. And so those kind of things really interest me. And of course, Freemasonry was a big part of what happened in Nauvoo. And as I discovered as I was researching the book, it was a big part of Joseph Smith's life, his whole entire life.
Right, right. Now, when you say that, and I'm not looking for anything scandalous or anything like that, but when you say that what we do today now, because I kind of agree with you here on this, what we do today now as Mormons isn't necessarily what Joseph Smith was doing, right? And I think that's throughout
Mhm.
every expression of Mormonism. I don't think that is unique to one church or one group of people. I think that's pretty commonplace.
Right.
What do you mean by that? What things in particular maybe you could enlighten the audience on there?
I don't know. I love the foundational document, foundational church,
Okay.
Um, and I think that, well, I mean, it was different in so many ways with like Joseph's emphasis on, I think, communitarianism, I think, had a lot
Mhm.
to do with what he was doing and how he brought in polygamy. I do believe that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. Today we have so many people pushing against that idea, but my research has shown me that he was, and just he had a lot of interest in esotericism as well, and we've really lost that a lot in the church. And I don't know. I feel this is kind of early to get into this, but I want to really talk about our temple, because I am an LDS, I am an active LDS temple, recommend holding LDS, but I recognize that it was very different in Joseph Smith's day, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that the church has changed the temple ordinances, because I think that we're a church of continuing revelation. So as these things don't mean as much to people, like for example, women veiling themselves, that had a very different connotation in Joseph Smith's day than it does now. Now it's like women are being subjugated and they're being, pushed down. And so we have to change that particular thing in order um, to have the same kind of feeling in the temple that people did back then. Um, in our modern culture, it would have to be changed, right? But I do really regret and feel sad that people don't understand the early temple ordinances and the way they were, and early symbolism, things that were in the church, esotericism, the reasons why Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging, and why he was involved with Freemasonry. I think that just in today's world, we just can't understand those things. And we have to put ourselves back in the 19th century in order to understand them. And that's kind of what I did as I wrote the book.
I think you're right there, certainly on a couple of accounts. The idea that, and I'm not a trained historian, right? I want to get that out of the way. I'm a land surveyor by profession, right? Um, but in being a land surveyor, you do figure out real quick that there is kind of a hierarchy of sources a little bit in weighing deeds and evidence and that sort of thing. But I agree with you when you say that things are different today, and so often that creeps into the way we look and read history, right? When we start using presentism
Yeah,
to try to
right.
understand what happened in the past, that's not a great lens to view that through, right? When we try to impose our 21st century morals and ideals, it's not going to translate well. And what we're going to find is that we're going to look back a lot, and rather than look at the good things some of our predecessors did, whether that be in Mormonism or whether that's with the country at large, we're going to find that if we use presentism as a tool of viewing that, we're going to be at odds with them a lot, and it's going to cause us to focus more on things that we perceive as negative from our 21st century standpoint rather than what the conditions were on the ground.
Absolutely. Yes. The more you get into what the 19th century way of thinking was, the more you realize that Joseph Smith was progressive, and he was, I think, amazing. Um, so it's easy to look back even on Brigham Young too, and criticize him for many things that he did. But I think that's looking with our modern eye. And it's true that some people in the community or in the country were at the time had ideas that were way ahead of their times. And we look at Brigham and we just give him so much criticism, but it's I don't know. I don't feel like he was I think that he was doing things for the best of motives, and I really think that Brigham loved Joseph and was trying to follow in his footsteps. That he really was trying to continue the church that he saw Joseph starting. And there were many things that he changed, but I think he was really trying to stick to what he'd been taught by Joseph.
Certainly I don't agree with Brigham on everything, right? Um,
Mm.
and to be honest with you, as I read Brigham Young, whether that's, some of his own journals or things in the Journal of Discourses, I don't think he expected everyone to agree with him on everything, even within his own flock, so to speak. The other thing that I would say is Brigham does get beat up a lot. And I've always said you got to put yourself in Brigham's shoes, right? I mean, this is a guy that just saw his best friend and his brother and a couple of his brethren from the church. Two of them were assassinated. The other two, the John Taylor was shot. I'm not sure I would have done anything a whole lot different than what he did, right? I mean, I do have my feelings on the race and the priesthood issue, but I mean, gosh, if you can line up with someone at 90% from 200 years ago, that's not a bad thing. That shows that there's a continuity there that continued from Joseph.
Yeah, he and Joseph both, I think, were rough frontier kinds of people. And they, like Joseph said, he was the rough stone rolling. But I think that really they had so many good qualities and so many spiritual affinities, and um, for Brigham to have led that entire people across the plains as he did and started a new society, he really had some amazing qualities that I think were really necessary for the Saints to even survive at the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. His leadership was, well, for that period in church history, he absolutely was the indispensable man. I mean, he had everything he needed, blessed by the Lord, to get done what needed to get done. So at what point did you get fascinated with Mormonism and Masonry?
Let's see. Really very early. But I started writing the book probably I don't know, maybe like 15 years ago. I started working on this masonry project pretty seriously. So I my husband, my I want to say my ex-husband. It's a long story.
You're good.
But Joe Swick, who I was married to, he's now in a skilled nursing facility. So he's kind of no longer able to be with us and talk with us, which is really, really sad because he was an amazing person and he is still, but he was the one that was working on this book. And so I became involved in the project. And after I became involved in the project is when we ended up getting married. So he's my second husband. And so he was the one that really kind of introduced me because he was a Freemason. And so he can kind of introduce me in a deeper way to what Freemasonry is all about and what he thought Joseph Smith was doing with Freemasonry and that kind of thing. So that's when I think I became very interested in it because it's hard to look at Freemasonry from the outside. It's sort of the same as looking at Mormonism from the outside. It's very difficult to understand like all the nuances and what's going on. So I guess when I got involved with Joe is when I really just became so fascinated and interested in Freemasonry and Mormonism.
Gotcha. Now, a lot of times Mormons, and I don't care what breed of Mormon you are, we do get beat up on this a little bit. This Masonic connection, right? A lot of stuff gets thrown out there about how bad the Masons are or were or whatever the case is, and we get beat up over it a little bit. Did you were there ever moments when you were doing some of this research where you felt like it was maybe putting your testimony on shaky ground or anything? Did it ever concern you?
No, in fact, this has really strengthened my testimony. And I think that reading the book, you've read the book, so you can probably attest to this, but I think you can read the book from several different viewpoints. You can read the book from kind of an anti-Mormon viewpoint and say, oh, Joseph Smith was involved in Freemasonry, and discount that he ever got any inspiration. But you can also look at it in other ways too. And so I think that we tried to write the book so from a sort of a faithful perspective, so that you can have a faithful perspective and realize that Joseph Smith was involved in Masonry without it like ruining your testimony. It never did. It never did harm my testimony in any way, because I feel, you know, in my head, I can work my head around what he was doing with Masonry and why he enjoyed it so much and why he was fascinated with Freemasonry and brought it into the religion. So,
Yeah. I think so often as members of Mormonism, again, whatever flavor that is, where we get this idea, and I can't fully understand why it is we come to this conclusion, but sometimes we think revelation happens for Joseph in a vacuum, so to speak, right? Where just all of a sudden he wakes up one night and he jots down D&C 130, whatever, or 20 something, whatever the case may be. I don't think that's an accurate representation of the process, right? As I look at certainly the first vision, that revolves around Joseph asking a question. I think we can look at all of the Doctrine and Covenants for the most part and see that this is Joseph questioning like we all are, right? In his case, he's saying, how do I lead a church, right? And out of that comes what is now the Doctrine and Covenants, because he had to be educated on those things from the Lord. And so sometimes I think when things like Masonry pop up, I don't necessarily look at that as something that we should shy away from. I think that's something that can give us some insight into how that revelatory process worked for Joseph, right? And
yes, absolutely.
I think he
So,
saw things that he recognized, to be honest with you. Um, and I think that was huge for that process. It spurred him on in a lot of ways, I think.
well, that reminded me of when I was first getting my patriarchal blessing years and years and years ago. I was new in the church. Um, so when I went into the patriarch, he was asking me questions about myself and my life and what I wanted to do and things like that. And I didn't want to answer him anything. I just wanted to. I didn't want him to know anything about me, and I wanted to see how inspired he would be. You know. So
Sure.
I didn't tell him anything about myself. But later, much later, when I had children and I was participating, or I was present when Patriarch gave my daughter a patriarchal blessing, and I saw how he asked her questions and, you know, tried to get to know a little bit about what she wanted to do with her life. And he actually told her, he said, you know, I always find it helpful for me to get revelation the more I know about a person. And I was like, oh, that's, you know, that's actually true. You know, you can get better revelation the more you know and the more you understand, the easier it is to get revelation. And so it's not like, you know, Joseph Smith was, it's not like discounting revelation to realize that he was such a sponge and that he took from everything he saw in his society. And he took, you know, here and there, took whatever he saw that was good and brought it in. And I think that that doesn't have to necessarily negate revelation.
Absolutely. And I think we see it the same thing when he learns Hebrew, right? When he studies Hebrew, there's some interesting doctrinal developments that happen from his exposure to Hebrew and the Hebrew scriptures, and that spurs him on. So I'm with you. I don't think this takes away from his revelatory ability one bit, or the veracity of the things that he claimed. I think that they're all part and parcel of that process. So real quick, when did Joseph's first exposure to Masonry begin?
I think when he was born, because I think that his family knew a lot about Masonry. I think today we just don't realize how pervasive Masonry was in the society they lived in. Back then, like 1 in 10, 1 in 8 people were Freemasons, men. Sorry, 1 in 10 men were Freemasons. And so you had like your next door neighbor, your uncle, which Joseph Smith's uncle was a Mason, and cousins, and your doctor, the doctor that worked on his leg operation was a Mason. And so he knew Masons all around him. And then when there was a big scandal that happened in Masonry when Joseph Smith was a young man, and there became an anti-Masonic movement in the country where they were going around exposing or doing these exposés on what happened in a lodge. And so you could go down the street and they'd be doing a representation of what happened in the lodge to try to expose it. And Joseph Smith would have been very aware of these things. It was in the newspaper, it was in publications. And so you didn't have to be a Mason to know what was going on or what happened in the lodges. And so I think he was very, very much exposed to it from an early age.
Got you. I think you brought out something that's pretty interesting there, because I did do some research on Freemasonry years ago. And what I remember in doing my research is just what you had said, that there was a moment in American history and that was very fearful of Masonry. Most of our founders were Masons, and during that time period, it seemed okay. And then I can't remember what the scandal was, but I remember reading about it. And then it churned. And I think one of the things that I find interesting is it wasn't like that was a way to necessarily get popular with the public at large in 19th century America by becoming a Mason. So, yeah.
Right. This is a big thing that my co-authors and I discuss a lot, is that many people say that Joseph Smith started a lodge in Nauvoo, or allowed the lodge in Nauvoo to happen because he wanted to become friends with, the Freemasons. And maybe because they'd been kicked out of Missouri, maybe he wanted to, curry favor with the surrounding Freemasons. And actually, we see almost the exact opposite happening. He did not do this to get friends, because if he had, he would have done things totally differently, because what he did was he entered Masonry and then started shaking it all up and doing things differently and getting in trouble, So he wasn't doing it to have friends.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Where's some of the earlier parts of maybe Joseph's ministry that we can see Masonic ideas and Masonic parallels, I guess, start to become visible?
Well, in the book I wrote, we talk about the first vision, even as far back as the first vision, having intimations of Freemasonry. But you really see it in the Book of Mormon. You can see many, many parallels to Freemasonry in the Book of Mormon, and they're not all bad. There are historians that say that the Book of Mormon was anti-Masonic, but I don't see it that way, as you probably realize from reading that book.
Right.
I see there are parallels to good Masons and bad Masons, because Joseph Smith thought that Freemasonry had become corrupt, as it was in the United States at the time. So he almost felt the same about Masonry as he did about Christianity, that it had become apostate and that he was going to restore it. So there are writers, Masonic writers, that talk about a restoration of pure Freemasonry. And I think that that's kind of what Joseph thought he was doing, was he was going to go into Freemasonry and then restore it, as he was doing with Christianity.
Okay. All right. So does he
so your question, wait. Let me go back to your question. So in the
Yeah.
Book of Mormon, we see so many things. Like, first of all, we have Nephi building a temple, and the temple is not an Old Testament type of temple. It's a Masonic type of temple. It is like a Solomon's temple in the Masonic view. So the Masons, when they built their temples, they were patterning them on Solomon's temple in the Old Testament, but Joseph's temples both in the Book of Mormon and when he began to build temples are more like Masonic temples than they are like Old Testament temples.
Interesting. So, and now, because if I remember the scripture correctly, and I could be wrong, doesn't it say that it was after the pattern of Solomon's temple?
Yes, it does. But you don't see what happened in Solomon's temple happening in the Nephite temples. You don't see sacrifices, animal sacrifices, that kind of thing. You see, it's more of a Masonic type temple. But it's really there's so many parallels that you guess you'll have to go to the book. But even in the book, I had to cut it down and just use a few examples because there are so many examples of what that we can pick up in the Book of Mormon from Freemasonry.
Absolutely. And that's fascinating too, right? Because and I'm going to make an assumption here, so please correct me if I'm wrong on this, Cheryl. But as people who believe in the process of the Book of Mormon coming forward, right? If he's actually translating, so to speak, whether that's through a seer stone or the Urim and Thummim, take your pick, whether that's going on, I find it interesting that in that ancient document we see these parallels already, and it's very early on in the Book of Mormon. I think that does speak to some of the veracity of the things he's reading and discovering along the way. So, at what point does Joseph become a Mason himself?
So he doesn't become a Mason until 1842 when the Masonic Lodge is started in Nauvoo. And so he's only a Mason for those last 2 years. And the same thing with a lot of people say about Brigham Young, that he was a Mason before, but no, he wasn't a Mason before. He joined the Masonic Lodge at the same time Joseph did. So there were about 40 people in Nauvoo at the time that we can identify that were Masons before they came into Mormonism or into Nauvoo. And so those people started the lodge, and then Joseph Smith joined the lodge with many of the other early men.
We were talking here just a few seconds ago about it wasn't something that you could have done to win a popularity contest, right?
Right.
What do you think Joseph's impetus was for allowing a Nauvoo lodge to be built?
Okay, so that's a very good question, because that is a very question that I was trying to answer when I wrote the book and when I was involved in this book. Is I wanted to know, what was Joseph doing? What in the heck was he doing with Masonry? What was the reason why he allowed this lodge to come into being, and what was he doing with the lodge? And so I think there's a couple different reasons. And the first thing that I think is that he really was fascinated with Masonry and what it could teach him about the ancient past, and just the ritual, I think, really appealed to him as well. And he was believing, like I said earlier, he was believing that he was going to go in and restore pure Freemasonry, and that was a big part of his mission. But also what he was doing was, we see them bringing in so many members into the lodge. So even when they started the lodge out, that with these 40 members, this was more than any other lodge in the state of Nauvoo, or in the state of Illinois, sorry. And in fact, it was almost more Masons than the entire state of Illinois. Holy because cow. Masonry had become so decimated during that scandal, the Morgan affair, that there were very few Masons in the state. And so we have this lodge, and then in the first year, there were about 245 members in the lodge. So that's a huge amount, because generally a Masonic lodge will bring in maybe a couple people, maybe 1 or 2 people, at the most like 2 people a month, and they were bringing in like 3 people a day, and sometimes they would meet twice a day and bring in 6 people a day, and just bring in so many Masons, make so many Masons. So what we see is that Joseph Smith's um, that he had plans to kind of, I don't know, take over the lodge in Illinois. And what we have at the time was some talk about they wanted to eventually get a national Grand Lodge, which would be over all of the United States, and it would have jurisdiction over all of the lodges in every one of the states. And I feel that Joseph thought that by having this power in the state of Illinois, by having so many Freemasons, that he could become, he or the members of the lodge in Nauvoo could become influential in the Grand Lodge. And so they could affect how the rituals were done, and in that way that he could easily work on this restoration that he pictured. So it's kind of complicated, but I do lay that out in the book. But I think that if he had had the chance to do this, I think that it may be Masonry would have been very different today with the Mormons' influence.
How do you see that being? How do you think that would have looked today? I'm going to ask you to put on your hypothesis hat now and maybe take a stab at that if you're comfortable.
Oh yeah, I really have no idea. But I know that he did want to work on the ritual, and he wanted to work on what he saw as things that were not going right in Masonry, that were kind of apostate in Masonry. So perhaps Masonry would have a better reputation now than it does today. I mean, I know a lot of people are afraid of Masonry. They think there's evil going on because it's very secretive. So it could be that they could have influenced it so it had a better perception, or it could be even worse because Mormons aren't looked on as being the greatest. I mean, people are scared of Mormons too. So I don't know. It's really hard to say what would have exactly happened, but I think it would at least look very different than it does today.
Well, look, there's a reason you should be scared of Mormons. Anyone that shows up at your doorstep with that many cookies just to welcome you to the neighborhood can't be up to any good. No. So
they have ulterior motives.
Absolutely. At what point because certainly we can, as you pointed out, there's some things in the Book of Mormon that we can see that definitely have Masonic overture, so to speak, or something that rings of Masonry there. But at what point do you feel like in your research, Joseph really begins to understand? At what point does he say, oh, I see what this is. This used to be X. Now it's Y. I need to help it get back to X. When do you think it is that in his ministry that he recognizes, what's going on in Masonry and that there's something to this?
Yeah, I couldn't really say, but I know that so Masonry has a bifurcated priesthood. So they have an Aaronic and a Melchizedek priesthood. And so at least by the time that Joseph Smith brings in Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood, I think he's recognizing there that, there's this connection. So I think that in so many ways he's fascinated when we get the Egyptian influence come into into Mormonism with the mummies that come to Kirtland, and Joseph is translating the Book of Abraham. I think he's seeing a lot of connections with Masonry at that time because Masonry had a lot of influence from the Egyptian secrets, and so I think he's seeing it all over the place.
Gotcha. So when he gets down to really getting the temple ceremony together, right now, I'm not going to go into the Masonic or the Mormon temple ceremony because I want to be respectful to both of those traditions, but the dramas, if you will, that take place in there are vastly different, right? So often I think that for maybe some of our and I'm going to use the term Christian here, referring to evangelicalism or that sort of thing. I think when they hear that, hey, Joseph stole the Masonic rites, and that's how the Mormons have their temples now. How much weight does that carry for you from a scholarly perspective, especially one like yourself who's studied Masonry in depth, but also you're someone who has been through the temple, so you understand the drama there. That's not a fair assessment in your mind, is it? That he just stole it whole cloth from the Masons?
No, not at all. But we do see that right at the time in Masonry, what was happening was that it was perfectly acceptable for people to develop new rituals. So during that time, you would have certain lodges get together and make like an Egyptian ritual or a Native American ritual or something like that. And that was they were appendant degrees. We had the three Blue Lodge degrees, but then we had all kinds of degrees in the United States that people were coming up with during this 1840s period. And they were really interesting. They would make these rituals, and that wasn't frowned upon. And so for Joseph Smith to develop a ritual that was similar to Masonry and that was using the same kind of presentation, that wasn't unusual. And so I don't think that that's what the other Masonic lodges were critical of him for. They never criticized him. Other Masons didn't criticize him for coming up with a ritual. They didn't say he's copying Masonic ritual and we don't like this. You know, that was okay with them. And so what he was doing was using Masonry and developing ritual around a certain method of presentation. And we do have some things that are very, very similar to Masonry. And then we have others that, as you said, like the Adam and Eve in the garden is different than what the Masons' presentation of their ritual was. So
you
see some real differences.
Wow. So
You
didn't find anywhere where other Masons were critical of Joseph during this time?
Not for that. I mean, there were other reasons. They mainly were really upset that they were bringing so many men into the lodge. They were saying, you're going too fast. You're making the Masons really fast. Like they would get 1 degree one day and the next day get their 2nd degree and a week later get their 3rd degree, when in other places it would take a month to go through each degree. And like I said, there were so many hundreds and hundreds of men coming into the lodge. By the time that Joseph Smith, or by the time that Brigham Young left Nauvoo, there were like at least 1,500 men that we can identify, and I think a lot more that we can't identify, because there are many other Mormon lodges around the area, and they were doing the same thing. And so that was what they were getting criticized for. They weren't getting criticized for new ritual. They weren't getting criticized for bringing women in, because the Relief Society was sort of almost like a lodge for women, but they weren't getting criticized for that either. So that's, at least not from other Masons, did not have a problem with that. So isn't that interesting?
That's fascinating, right? Because, there are, there have been, I guess the right word would be allegations that it was some Masons involved in the mob that killed Joseph. I didn't see any evidence of that when I studied it out. Now, let me say this. There were enough Masons running around at the time, right, that it would be like, I don't know, you're bound to get 1 or 2 in there, right? That doesn't mean that that's indicative of Masonry. That means that
yes, in the book I actually went through in the book to see how many Masons there would have been in those lodges right there in that area, and it wasn't more than like 20. So it wasn't like there were hundreds of Masons that were there, trying to kill Joseph Smith. So
right.
We have the names of them. We know exactly who they were, and there's no indication that they were. I mean, there may have been Masons in the crowd, as you said, but it wasn't. It wasn't a huge group of them.
No, and I think it's also worth pointing out too that Masonry didn't just. It wasn't something that even people who weren't Masons weren't aware of, right? I mean, there's a large part of our the way that Congress started doing their meetings, right? When they held a session of conference, it was often the same sort of procedures that were used in Masonry, right? The recognizing of people to talk when there was councils. It had a massive impact on the United States at
Yeah.
large. I
Yes.
also
Yes, that's true.
okay, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there. The other thing I'd say is even some of our vernacular have Masonic overtones. When we say it's a square deal, right? That refers
Yeah.
back to that has Masonic roots. And so it kind of permeated American culture by and large
Yeah.
to this day. As Joseph begins to really implement temple teachings and temple ideas, not just the drama, but the idea of sealings and temple work and that sort of thing. Is there anything overly Masonic in those teachings?
Well, I mean, the Masons had something that was like a fraternal tie, and they also applied it to like their families as well, that they were bound in a chain, the bright eternal chain. And so I think that this is something that's not unfamiliar to Masons, and perhaps could have even influenced Joseph Smith's thinking as well. But so what were you asking about that? With the
Was there?
ceilings.
Yeah, when it comes to temple doctrine, do we see anything overtly Mason in the temple
Well,
doctrines?
I
Not so
do.
much
I
the
really do.
drama.
I see a lot. Yeah, I do see a lot, and it's throughout the book it talks about these things. So, for example, the um just coming into the presence of God in the way the celestial ascent. A lot of writers have said that Masons don't have celestial ascent. Well, yes, actually, their whole ritual is all about celestial ascent. And I think I use a whole entire chapter to show how Masons, their temple ritual is, or their ceremonies are to come into the presence of God and to do a celestial ascent, including going upstairs and everything else. So I think that was very similar. That as he gets into the temple ritual, that it is very similar to Freemasonry. And so some people, that's why some people like to say, in order to explain this, they like to say that
Want more from the Mormon Renegade podcast? Head over to the Mormon Renegade Rumble page to see all the videos from the podcast and the fundamental news program for free. Still not enough? Then join the Mormon Renegade Locals page by clicking the red join button, and for $5 a month, you can have access to podcast transcripts, Renegade exclusives, as well as weekly live stream show with the host Dave Sanders. Click the link in this episode's show notes today.
That they're all based on sort of an eternal, an ancient or an eternal model. And so Joseph was accessing this, and Masons were accessing this. So a lot of people say that. And then you can look at it another way and say that Joseph was taking these ideas from Masonry as well. So we really don't know exactly how those thoughts got from Masonry to Mormonism, but we just do see a very strong similarity in all the temple work with Masonry.
Absolutely. I think it's worth pointing out too that the idea that Mormons have isn't really unique. This idea of deification, if you will. I don't know if that's a real word, but that's one I'm going to use. Because we can even see that, I believe it's in the federal Capitol building, where it shows there's a mural, and I remember seeing it where it shows Washington essentially being taken up, right? And I don't think that idea of deification or the celestial ascent is totally uniquely Mormon. I think it is in context of religion, right? I don't see a lot of other Christian religions talking about that celestial ascent, so to speak. But it was around, right? There were other flavors of that, I guess.
Yeah.
Let me ask this question, because this is one that I've been curious about a little bit. Do we see any connections with like plural marriage and Masonry? Does Joseph's Masonic background, so to speak, have any bearing on that theology?
I do not see much of that at all, except for the fact that Solomon is a big figure in Freemasonry. And of course, we know Solomon's the
Right.
one in the Bible that had so many wives. But I don't see a direct connection with plural marriage at all.
Okay. All right. No, that's good. Let me ask this question. And maybe this, because you dealt with it a little bit in the book, but not a lot. I want to go past Joseph's time now, and I want to go into to kind of that early Utah period with Brigham Young.
Okay.
Do we see Brigham continuing on this idea of having Masonic lodges in Salt Lake, in Utah?
So I think Masonry was always important to Brigham because we do see him preaching. Some of his talks we have in the Journal of Discourses reference Masonry in a positive way. So I think he always had this feeling of affinity with Masonry, but he also did he really blamed Masons for Joseph Smith's death. And several people thought that when Joseph Smith was falling out the window and he said, "Oh Lord, my God," that he was starting the Masonic plea
Right. Yeah.
of, "Oh Lord, my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" And so Brigham Young interpreted it as if there were Masons in the crowd, they should have helped at that period, at that point, and they didn't
Oh,
help. And he was very angry with how Masons had treated Joseph Smith. So he did not continue the Masonic Lodge when they got to Utah. He decided that that would not be part of the religion going forward. So there was actually just kind of a split. There were other people Gentiles that came in and formed a Masonic lodge in Utah, but Brigham would not allow the Mormons to join that lodge. And that, in fact, continued until like the 1970s, where Mormons were not allowed to, at least in Utah. In other states they were, but in Utah, they were not allowed to join a Masonic lodge and still have a good, their membership would be in jeopardy if they did such a thing.
gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. What do you think overall? And this is something I always like to ask on these kind of topics because I'm not a guy who is angling for the destruction of any Mormon sect, right? I just don't have that in me. What do you say to people when what would you tell people as they look at these old documents, they find stuff on Joseph and Masonry and they get freaked out, right? They all of a sudden start questioning, well, gosh, is the temple ritual valid because it has stuff from Masonry in it? How do you answer that question?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think first of all, and this is why I think the book is still going to be important, like years from now. I think it's going to always be important to look at this book because I think that we can see what appealed to Joseph Smith about Freemasonry and what was beautiful about Freemasonry, what was, lovely and of good report that he really liked, and why was he involved in Freemasonry? Because there's these good things about it, because there's this beautiful fraternity of men. There's this this helping of the poor and the widows, and there's this beautiful esotericism, symbolism, and wanting to draw closer to God and to become good men, good people. So first of all, I think I would point to that is because so many people are afraid that Masonry is devilish. And why would Joseph Smith want to be involved in the secret society that was so devilish? But so first of all, I think they need to realize what the good things were. And also back in the 1840s, Masonry had such a Christian emphasis as well. They brought many things in from the Old Testament, but it was a Christian view of the Old Testament. Like they believed that the Old Testament people were performing Christian, symbolism was happening. So I really like to point to that so people aren't afraid of Freemasonry and they realize that Joseph could have seen something good in Freemasonry, and also just not to worry so much about that there are similarities in the temple, because if Joseph felt that these things could teach someone something about religion or about God, then what's the problem with using them? They were part of society at the time, and it would be a good thing to bring those in because people were familiar with them and they helped them, understand certain things that they might not understand any other way.
Okay. With that in mind, because you brought up that word again, esotericism, right? And that's something that I found a lot in the book. Could you explain to the audience what you mean by that?
So, well, the word esoteric just means hidden, right? It's a secret, And so Joseph was doing many things with secret, and hidden is the word I'm looking for. So we know a lot of times when we're learning something in religion that it's hidden to our view. And so we sort of have to learn in a religious sort of way, in a spiritual sort of a way. We have to learn certain things before we can see what's hidden, And so I think that's what's so, what I love about things like the Book of Isaiah and a lot of things in the 19th century, and especially in Freemasonry and ritual, that there's something hidden or secret or hidden that we can grow spiritually to a point where we're able to see these hidden things. I don't know.
No, I think you're 100% correct. And sometimes I think that's easier for converts to Mormonism, whatever flavor again that is at least for me, and I won't speak for anybody else, but I have heard others say this. Certainly for me, as I heard, as I found out about Work for the Dead, right? That was a big thing to me as a young man. My father passes when I'm young, and I have questions, right? Where does he go? What happens? And so when these things are taught to me, it's not so much this idea of I've discovered something new, but rather a remembering, so to speak. And sometimes I think that word esotericism can really describe that process of, yes, it's a discovery, but it's not a discovery as in something brand new. It's a discovery in something of I remember. And I think Masonry obviously offered something of that sort to be able to not just appeal to Joseph, but also to appeal to guys like Washington and Franklin and Jefferson and all those guys who really pushed forward the American experiment. And sometimes I don't feel like it gets enough credit for doing that. So
yeah, I agree.
So as Joseph, in your estimation, how pivotal was Masonry to Joseph's doctrinal theology? If you were going to put a bow on the whole thing, just how valuable was it to Joseph?
I think very valuable, but it's hard to really say. I mean, you can't really put a percent, like 50%, or you can't really do that. I mean, I just think that it was very valuable to him and he used it. But here's a criticism that we get a lot with the book. A lot of people say that our book sees Masonry in everything, and that there are other influences on Joseph besides Masonry. And the thing is that we agree with that, and we say that several times in the book, and in our promotional material, we say, yes, there were other things that came into Mormonism besides Masonry, but everybody wants to say that our book is just dealing with Masonry. Well, yeah, that's because that's why we wrote the book, is to show the Masonic influence. I don't feel like I need to, talk about 20 other influences, because that's not what my book is about. That's what other books are about. So I do feel that there were many, many other influences on Joseph's life that went into Mormonism. So I don't want to say that that Masonry had this much percent or that much percent, but I do feel that it was one of the important influences on Joseph as the religion was developing. So
right, no, I would agree with you. But see, I don't think people, and this is where I think I might differ a little bit from some other folks, is that I expect to see some things that aren't necessarily unique to just Mormonism, right? I believe it was Brigham Young who said all truth belongs to Mormonism, right? And so if that's the case, and there's scattered truth all over, well, I would expect to see,
Mhm.
you know, a little bit here from Catholicism, here from evangelicalism or Protestantism of its day. I would expect to see truth coming in from Masonry, and all these things I think are really what make up the gospel, right? Now, certainly, I don't want to take away from Joseph being a doctrinal innovator, because he absolutely was. I
Mhm.
think you know, the theology he puts forth on vicarious work for the dead, I think that's pretty unique to Joseph Smith. I don't see that in very many other religions. So I'm not taking away from his prophetic counsel, or excuse me, his prophetic calling. And I don't think Masonry
Mhm.
has to be something we look at and say, well, that means that Joseph's not a prophet anymore if we see that.
Right. And I think that's the primary fear, is that if we accept that Joseph got anything from Masonry, that we're saying that he did not get inspired, and that he's not a prophet, and that he wasn't inspired spiritually or from, to the divine. And I don't think that we have to make that choice. I think that he can bring things in from different places and still be inspired as to what he brings in. And he gets revelation, he gets a little bit here, a little bit there, and you know, if he starts bringing in the wrong things, he gets inspired to not use them anymore because they're wrong. So yeah, I feel like that all has a part, and you don't have to be afraid of it.
No, and the other thing I would say is that I think I think that in some ways the fact that Joseph recognizes something in Masonry, just like he recognized certain eternal truths in Catholicism and in evangelicalism and all these other things, and he takes all those and he looks at it and then gets revelation. I think that's a big pattern I think we should, as Mormons, should follow, right? Because I think that's one of the promises of Mormonism, is this idea that you know, and you kind of see it in Joseph's writings of, hey, I've had my revelatory experiences and you can too, right? And so if
Yeah.
we're open enough, right, you don't want to be a mutual friend of ours has once said, you want to be open-minded but not open-minded enough that your brain falls out, right? So let me say that. But if we're well grounded and well anchored to the gospel, I think that would be something Joseph would be eager for us to continue, right? Go get your own experiences here a little bit, right? And make sure you're anchored and tethered to the gospel, but you shouldn't worry about diving into something and finding something that you feel, gosh, I kind of connect with this a little bit. This speaks to my heart,
Mhm.
and then take that and pray
Right.
about it, because you might get something out of it. And I think
Right.
Joseph really sets that pattern here. And I'm kind of like you. I never read his brushes with masonry, if you will, and got freaked out about it. I just think, well, I think this is kind of a gift in some ways for us as members. I think it shows how Joseph went through the revelatory process, and you know, if we're trying to get revelation on something, I mean, of course we would do our research first, right?
Right. Right.
And I find that to be hugely supportive in my walk as a Mormon, because again, we want to do the things Joseph did. I think he set a pattern for us, definitely. Do we see we talked about the two different priesthoods, the Aaronic and the Melchizedek, and you mentioned that Masonry had something similar. Now, they didn't call them priesthoods though, did they?
Yes, they called it the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthood. Isn't that really fascinating?
They okay.
Yes,
All right.
yes. Isn't that fascinating?
And were they broke up into quorums like we have in Mormonism today?
Um, Not in quite the same way. No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Cheryl, is there anything else that you feel like we brushed over that you wanted to go into deeper?
I don't know. I just I wanted to tell you that I've got a couple more books coming out like this at the end of this month, and well, they don't have quite as much to do with Freemasonry, but one is about plural marriage. I have a book where I've taken essays from many different people who Mormons who write about plural marriage, and so it's called Secret Covenants, New Insights on Mormon Plural Marriage. And that one's coming out at the end of the month. And then I also have one on William Marks. I don't know if you've heard of William Marks, but he was an early church leader in Nauvoo that many people thought should succeed Joseph Smith after he died. And because Brigham did, he kind of was pushed off to the side, and we don't hear about him as much. But he had a lot of influence in early Mormonism, so that's going to be an interesting biography to
Do you mind if I pick your brain? Do you have a moment that I could pick your brain on your book about plural marriage? Because obviously I'm a fundamentalist, and that's kind of a big thing.
Yeah. Of course.
What inspired you to do that?
Oh, plural marriage is so fascinating to me because I do. Okay, so lately we have a group of people, many people, in fact, who are starting to push this idea that Joseph Smith never taught or practiced polygamy. And so I've become very interested in this because Mormon historians like me are generally saying, that's stupid. Of course, everyone knows that Joseph practiced polygamy. But these people are making very good points because we do have very little contemporary evidence that there was polygamy before Joseph Smith died. And many of the things that we do have are problematic. And so many people are listening to this idea and thinking that plural marriage started with Joseph Smith and not Brigham Young. Brigham Young, not Joseph Smith. So I feel like that historians should take this seriously because so much of our research and what's been written on plural marriage is outdated. We have Brian Hale's trilogy is like 10 years old now. And same with Todd Compton's In Sacred Loneliness is, and these people are bringing out new documents that have come out since the Joseph Smith papers, and not that we don't know about them, but we haven't analyzed them in depth. So anyway, I think it's really important to address what they're saying because they have good point. And I still believe that Joseph practiced polygamy and taught polygamy, but I need to have the documentation to show these people that that I'm not just making this up. Yeah, that we're not just making this up, and that it actually did happen. So that's important. And then there's different aspects that we go into in the book as well. Like Todd Compton wrote a book about, an article or a chapter, sorry, about were there eternity-only marriages? Where in Nauvoo, were there any marriages where people were sealed for eternity only and not for time and eternity? And he makes a really good case, and that's an interesting article. My chapter is about Emma Smith. So we know that Emma denied that Joseph Smith ever lived polygamy till the end of her life. So why was that? And what motivation could she have had? And so that's what my chapter goes into. So there's just different chapters that address some of these issues that we're facing recently.
So I don't want you to give away the book because I'm still a fan of capitalism, but let me ask you this. What was your takeaway of Emma on that? Because I've always found this fascinating, right? Because I try to be careful in my, certainly as a guy who's got two wives, I'm not so blind to say I don't have a vested interest here because I do, right? I mean, it's my family.
Right.
But at the same time, there are certain things that I see Emma do, especially after Joseph dies, which I got to admit stick in my craw a little bit, right? Where I'm like, okay, what are we doing here? What did you get any sort of idea of what happened here?
So what I end up doing in this chapter is I give three possibilities of why she could have done this, why this happened. And I'm not going to tell you what all three were, but all I'll do is I'll throw out a question because many of the later polygamists in Utah would be asked, well, why did you deny it? Why did Joseph deny polygamy when he was in Nauvoo? Why did you personally deny you were living polygamy? And they always said, well, we didn't, we tried to be honest, but we didn't, we said maybe we weren't living spiritual wifery, which they considered to be a different thing than celestial plural marriage, or they'd kind of beat around the bush, but they denied it. They denied they were living it at the time before the death of Joseph Smith publicly. That's what they did. And so now we have Emma who's denying it. And suddenly when the Saints moved to Utah, they don't give Emma the same grace that they give themselves when they were lying about it. They thought that maybe possibly could Emma have felt that this was like a kind of a covenant thing that she had always promised never to reveal.
That's fascinating,
possibility, right? But there's several others. But I think that we can give her the same kind of grace that we gave Joseph Smith when he was denying it. If we believe that he was practicing it yet denying it at the same time, then why don't we allow Emma to do the same thing?
I think you could definitely be onto something there. Absolutely. I've dealt with this quite a bit, actually, and even on the podcast, right? I've made a big push. And again, I'm not a trained historian, right? But I am a guy who understands, hierarchy of sources, those sorts of things. And the evidence for me seems overwhelming, always did, that these things were practiced, these things were lived. And it did force me to say, okay, so why wasn't Joseph completely forward with practicing plural marriage in Nauvoo? And why is it Brigham Young is so forward about it, right? If you didn't...
Well, wait, can I burst in here, because I had to burst in.
Absolutely.
The fact that if Brigham Young had died at the same time Joseph did, we would never know that Brigham practiced it either, because he did not admit to it until later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not like he was forthright or anyone else was forthright about their practicing polygamy during that time, that short period of time.
Absolutely. And let's put it into context on why they might be a little tight-lipped about this whole thing, right? They wanted to kill Joseph because he said he had another book of scripture. Okay? Just that. That was enough to get him and his followers driven from New York to Ohio to Missouri, right? Now, what happens if you upset the apple cart by upsetting everybody's Victorian sensibilities with this idea of plural marriage, right? You want to talk about pitchforks and torches. That would have been huge. And so the question gets asked, well, why is Brigham so open about it? Well, Brigham's not even in the United States, right? The Mormons left the country. And so Brigham's got a certain level of autonomy that just was not afforded to Joseph in his day because of his geographical location and the population that he was working with and working in at the time. Yeah. And I think all those have to be taken into consideration when you ask that question about, well, why doesn't Joseph ever just come out and say it? I did find it interesting that you brought up the term spiritual wifery there a little bit, because in papers that were coming from the East, you did see that the conflation of celestial plural marriage and spiritual wifery were the same thing, but the early saints didn't understand it that way. Is that correct?
This is a very deep question because there were people that did call early celestial plural marriage spiritual wifery. I call it wifery. So we do have evidence of that. But at a certain point, they started saying that John Bennett's type of kind of immorality was spiritual wifery, and that celestial plural marriage was something different that included a ceremony and eternal marriage, that kind of thing. So there was an early push to differentiate the two of those things.
Okay.
But I'm not going to say that they never used that term, because we do have documentation that they did. But very early, they wanted to differentiate what unauthorized plural marriage was and what the authorized celestial plural marriage was.
So what was John Bennett doing that was different than, say, what Joseph or Brigham was doing?
Okay, so John Bennett was basically it was adultery and fornication he was committing, and they did not have a ceremony to go along with it where they were, bound together eternally. And he said he told the women that as long as nobody found out about it, it was okay. So as long as they kept it secret, that what they were doing was fine. So you can see that that was very different than what we picture Joseph Smith's eternal marriage is.
That's fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. And so when this book's going to be out at the end of this month?
Yes, it's actually on Amazon. You can look on Amazon. Actually just like put on Amazon my name, Cheryl L. Bruno, and that book will come up. And you can pre-order it, and it will come to you by May 30th or by May 20th. The other book
That's
will be out
awesome.
by May 30th. Yeah.
That's awesome. Everybody needs to go get a copy. That's
Oh,
good stuff.
I hope so. It's really fascinating, and it's being done by the most scholarly Mormon historians that know a lot about this subject. So it's very good.
What was your big takeaway out of going that in depth on plural marriage? I mean, what was it that you took away from that after doing the research, Cheryl?
I guess like in the preface, I talk about how there were people that we respect. The authors respect those people that lived plural marriage either willingly or grudgingly or enthusiastically. And I guess my takeaway is that plural marriage like appealed to people in many different ways. Some were doing it because they felt it was a religious obligation. Some saw it as, a grand religious principle that they were lucky to be able to be involved in. And so there are many, many motivations. That's my big takeaway. So many different motivations for living this principle. And I feel like same thing today among polygamists as well, as there could be many motivations behind doing what they're doing. So that's why we have to kind of look at all of them, and we can't just compartmentalize and just say that they were doing it for one reason only. It was kind of all over the place, and just
Yeah.
so fascinating, very interesting.
So did you find, like, as you went through like original sources, did you find that it did run that gamut? Like people were doing it grudgingly because they wanted to, quote, follow God's law, and then there were others who were just like, we're in this to win it, and we're going to go forward, and we're going to have a smile on our face doing it. I mean, did you see the gamut there?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, we see sources that people say that you're going to have more glory in the eternal life if you practice this principle, and I think they were excited about that and enthusiastic about it to live something. I don't know. In a way, they were freeing themselves from like societal constraints, almost seems like. And then others were like, well, the prophet said to do it. I believe it came from God, so I guess I'll do it. It's not going to be fun, you know? But
Right.
so they're all over the place, but they're people, and that's what's so interesting about how people respond to this kind of call, right?
That's funny. That's funny you say that about begrudging, like, well, I guess I got to do it. And I just flash back to my LDS days going, I did the same thing with my home teaching, right? Like, I don't want to get out of my sweats to go do it, but I guess it's on the table. I got to go get it done. That's fascinating. Real quick, who you talked about a second book, William Marks?
Right.
Fill the audience in on who he was exactly.
So in Nauvoo, William Marks was the stake president for the entire stake, and he was also the president of the High Council. And back in that day, you had the High Council in Zion, or the Standing High Council, which he was president of. And then you also had the 12, which was a traveling High Council. And in the Doctrine and Covenants, it tells us that the traveling High Council are not in charge of the saints in Zion. They are in charge of the saints out in the field, So when Joseph Smith died, and towards the end of Joseph Smith's life, the 12 started getting more and more power, right? It's true, but there wasn't, a change. It's still when Joseph died, a lot of people recognize that in our scriptures it says that they are a traveling high council. They don't have any jurisdiction over the saints, as a body. So many people thought that William Marks, well, some people thought it was Sidney Rigdon because he was the only surviving member of the first presidency. So perhaps Sidney Rigdon should succeed Joseph Smith. But many people thought that it was William Marks. He was not only stake president, the president of the High Council, but he was also in the Council of 50. And his position in the High Council of 50 was higher than both Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon. He also received his second anointings before Brigham Young as well. So he just seemed like he was the obvious choice to many people. Emma thought he was the obvious choice.
Emma did as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Emma explains in a letter, and I have a chapter on succession in this book that's very interesting that people will find fascinating. And so I say that William Marks is like the most important figure in Mormonism that nobody knows about.
Fascinating.
So because then after Brigham Young and the 12 took over, they were a little threatened by William Marks and kind of pushed him out of Nauvoo. And then after that, he searched the rest of his life for the true, where's the true gospel? He went to James Strang's movement. He went to Charles Thompson's movement, and he ended up being influential in bringing Joseph Smith III into the reorganized church. And he actually ordained him as the president of that church. And he was his first counselor until William Marks died. So just a fascinating story.
So because I'm always fascinated by some of I don't have another good word for it. If you do, please throw it at me, but kind of the politics of this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Because with William Marks, so this is a guy who's probably very well acquainted with Joseph Smith, right?
Oh yeah.
Because there wasn't, like, in those days, it wasn't unusual to be, quote, hanging out with the prophet, right? I mean, it's a smaller group of people. You hear him talk frequently. There's not the same level of distance that there is between us and, say, if you're in the LDS Church, Russell M. Nelson, right? It's fair.
Right, but also he was in the same ward, and he lived across the street from Joseph Smith.
Right. Was William Marks ever privy to like the teachings on plural marriage or anything like that? Was he ever engaged in the practice himself?
Yes, and of course, no, he wasn't engaged in the practice himself, but of course that plural marriage was secret at the time, so we don't have a lot of documentation, but we do have some documentation from William Marks that's very important on the question of plural marriage in Nauvoo. And I don't know that I want to tell you what it is. I want you to buy the book and find out.
I will buy the book, and I can respect that, Cheryl.
Because I do include also in the book all the letters and writings of William Marks that we have in appendices, so you can go to his actual words and what he said. He tells us about what Joseph told him about plural marriage right before he died. So that sounds almost
sounds almost like a smoking gun for guys who are
well, yeah, you'll have to see.
Well, that's fascinating stuff. Cheryl, we jumped on here to like start talking about Masonry, and then we branched way off. I mean, this was awesome. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It was so much fun to talk with you.
You too, and let's do it again. I would be fascinated to have you back on as you continue your work. Like I said, I feel like your work's got some significance that really applies to all of Mormonism, right? Whether you're LDS or whether you're a fundamentalist like I am, or someone from the community of Christ, I just feel like it spans the gamut because we get to know Joseph a little bit better, and that's huge. So absolutely, as you dig up more good stuff, keep me in mind because I'd love to talk to you again.
Okay, thanks. It was fun.
All right, bye everybody.